Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you today at the beginning of your important conference. I just want to thank the organisers for the opportunity to talk to us today. It's really a great pleasure. I want to talk about dietary transitions, and dietary transitions really to improve diet sustainability and hopefully lead to benefits to health as well. We've been looking at this issue in both the UK, or at least in Western Europe situation, and also we're doing work in India. And in the time we have today, I just want to concentrate on the Indian situation. It is quite different to that in Western Europe, and I think you'll find it. I hope you find it interesting. So just to give a bit of context to the talk, we've been working now for about 4 years with the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, whose headquarters just outside Hyderabad. And you can see Hyderabad is pretty well in the center of the semi-arid tropics region of India, which is big. And a lot of what ICSAT have been doing have been the development of climate-resilient crops which will grow well in very high temperatures and also with very low water demand. And it turns out that a range of millets have been seem to be the most successful, and I think as a result of that, really, UN have declared 2023 the International Year of Millets. I thought I would just quickly show you these photos. This was from a congress held in Delhi about 3 months ago now, that I was fortunate enough to go to, and it was the whole event was about global millets, and it was the event was opened by a very long and very emotive speech by the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who explained in great detail the importance of millets to India, not just in terms of nutrition, but also in terms of economics. And I suspect he was more interested in the economics. But it was very interesting to hear him talk and what he had to say. So the plan is really this dietary transition should be one that removes or reduces the amount of traditional staples in the diet of Indians, which are, wheat, rice, maize to some extent, and replace at least some of those with millets, for reasons that perhaps you'll see in a minute. And this is hopefully it'll improve diet sustainability. It will certainly likely to improve the supply of food, and hopefully it'll also reduce malnutrition. And that's something that I'll say a bit more about in a minute, because that has to happen. These are some of the key non-communicable nutrition-related diseases in India. One of the ones that's particularly prevalent is anemia. You can see here that in young children, about 60–70% are anemic. Young women, 50 to 60%. Less in men, but as you would expect, but still probably higher than in Western societies. Also, India is one of the highest parts of the world that has the highest stunting in children. And this is a really big issue. It has a long-term effect on children. I'll say a little more about that in a minute. The other thing, just to mention almost in passing, because we haven't time to spend much time on it, is the change in the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in India. You can see for the last 30 years, it's gone up progressively and pretty quickly. And in the last few years, the steepness of the rise, both in men and women, has increased. And this is, if you like, lurking behind everything that we say today. And will have to be, in my view, and it will have to be dealt with fairly quickly. And so overall, my contention is that sustainable diets will have to deal with these issues. There's no point in diets being sustainable to produce, or foods being sustainable to produce, if they don't deal with the big issues of the day, some of which are on the screen behind. I just add a little bit more complexity to this in a way. This is the issue of anemia. And you can see that overall, the risk of anemia reduces as iron consumption increases. The reference daily allowance, or dietary allowance for iron in young women in India is just under 30 milligrams per day, more or less the same as in the UK. But the average intake of young women is only about 14 milligrams per day, so less than half, or about half. And there'll be a lot in this lower end, below the average as well. So it's, in a sense, not surprising that anemia and perhaps predominantly iron deficiency anemia is quite prevalent. But there are other issues lurking there, if you like, that complicate matters. On the right-hand side here, you can see a study which was done to look at the rise in the risk of anemia in young women per milligram of iron intake. And you can see that the red circles here show that the poorest in the population and those that were substantially underweight hardly responded at all to the increased iron, whereas those that were richer, and the richest part of the population, responded, reasonably well, particularly the richest group. And I think you can probably assume, we don't know why that was exactly, but the chances are that the richer and richest parts of the population have a much more diverse diet, probably more vitamin C from fruit, which obviously is important in terms of utilization of iron. And there may be other reasons as well, but it's likely to be connected to diet. Studying at children, I said I'd say a little bit more about it. It's complicated. It's not simple. It's not just due to low chronic undernutrition, to substantial chronic undernutrition, but it's connected. Poor sanitation, these sorts of things have an impact. It's pretty well irreversible by the age of 2. And the critical thing is that it impacts the brain and nervous system and has a lifelong effect. It's not just a problem when children are children, but when they're adults as well. And overall, it's a combination of factors. It's certainly a combination of undernutrition and a lack of bone trophic nutrients, particularly calcium, vitamin D, and protein, and actually magnesium now as well. Protein is less, I think, understood. Protein is quite important, really, because it actually stimulates a hormone produced in the liver. And that hormone is really important in terms of the development of the growth plate and the elongation of the growth plate, provided, of course, that there's a supply of calcium, magnesium, and vitamin D. So it's a complicated thing to fix, but also very important for India. So I guess the question arising out of all of that is, how good are millets? We'll have a quick look at nutritional characteristics of them, and then we'll look at 1 or 2 other things. I've just incidentally, the numbers you'll see are all from this paper, or more or less all from this paper, which is produced by people from ICRISAT. So I know that the millets that are being shown, or the data that are being shown, are from contemporary millets that are typical of the millets that ICRISAT is trying to develop. And so in terms of protein, clearly an important nutrient. You can see that generally some of the millets are higher than rice and maize, and probably wheat as well. But there's a tremendous variability. For example, in pearl millet, this scientist who's in ICRISAT, he's a plant geneticist, has got pearl millets that have a range of protein contents from between 7 and 20 grams per 100 grams, 7–20%. Massive range. And I know we haven't yet sort of really understood how we can exploit, if we can, these very high protein millets. One of the problems is that we don't know a great deal about protein quality, and we don't know whether the protein quality in the 20 grams per 100 grams is equal to or better than the low protein content. So work in progress, I guess, but interesting and important. The other thing I to mention is dietary fiber. I think we now know dietary fiber is really important in relation to a number of things, but particularly perhaps the reduction in risk of colorectal cancer. The target in India is about the same as in the UK. It's about 30 grams of fiber per day. Certainly in the UK, only about between 2 and 4% of the population reach that figure. It's pretty abysmal, really. But you can see that millets substantially higher in dietary fiber than rice and wheat, and probably maize as well. So that's an important feature of them. In terms of micronutrients, calcium on the left, again, you can see that all of the millets there tending to be higher in calcium than the rice and maize and probably wheat. But one particular family, if that's the right word, of millets called finger millets, have a very high calcium content. You can see these two here have that one's 360, 450 milligrams calcium per 100 grams, more than 10 times the amount in these pearl millets. Now, we assume that's a good thing. One of my questions always is, well, if you have a very high calcium content, what is missing? Because if you increase something, something will have to disappear. And again, I don't know the answer to that, but nevertheless, a great potential there. Iron, much more variability in iron content in millets, but again, certainly higher than rice. And some of them are on a par with maize. But again, a bit like protein in a way, we don't know very much, in fact, very little, about the bioavailability of the nutrients. And there's no point in having a very high iron millet, for example, if most of the iron isn't actually absorbable by the digestive system. It's not a good idea to have that. But at the minute, data on bioavailability are pretty slim. Other thing we've been doing for the last 2 years, 2 and a bit years with ICRSAT is to carry out systematic reviews and meta-analyses of millets and nutrition-related human health aspects. We published now, I think, about either 7 or 8 papers. I'm not exactly sure, but there were six on the screen here when I did this presentation. I think there's at least 1 more now. Only 2 things we're going to look at in the time we have today. First of all, the effect of millet on iron status, using either hemoglobin as the measure of iron status or serum ferritin. Serum ferritin is slightly different in the sense that it's more of a measure of iron storage in the body. Hemoglobin more a reflection of iron intake. And if you look at both of those, you can see that including millet in the diet improved the situation overall for hemoglobin, and was so the same for the case with serum ferritin. Fewer studies, of course. But, and it's quite a big but, unfortunately, the heterogeneity we measured in these studies was very high. 87%, nearly 90% heterogeneity. And that basically means that the studies that we have here vary a lot in terms of what they did, what they measured, what the control features were, etc. And unfortunately, high heterogeneity reduces the sort of value of the evidence that you see there quite a lot. And it just means that, we need more studies as always. But still, the overall direction of travel, if you like, was pretty good. Of course, when we think about iron, we know this for years and years, that we need to worry about vitamin C. Vitamin C is important because it has a beneficial effect on the absorption of iron from the food in the digestive tract. So vitamin C is important. Vitamin D is also important. This is relatively new information. In perhaps the last 2 years, that there is a connection between vitamin D and iron status. Vitamin D needs iron for its activation. Vitamin D that we have in food, or even that which we synthesize in the skin, is not active. It has to go through an activation process in the liver, and then another activation process in the kidney. In the kidneys, and both of those processes need iron. The other one just to show today, which is particularly relevant to the diabetes story that we looked at earlier, is the millets in the diet and glycemic control. Glycemic control really is how well the body can control circulating glucose concentration in the blood. If it fails to do that very well, then generally blood glucose will start to rise, and when it starts to rise, it's indicative of poor glycemic control. It's a feature of the progression into pre-diabetics and into type 2 diabetes. So it's a very important feature, and a particularly important feature given the prevalence of diabetes in India. So you can see that in terms of the glycemic index is the speed really with which the body can actually absorb glucose from the carbohydrates in the food. And generally the lower in terms of diabetes is the best. So you can see here in terms of glycemic index, the pearl millet that was looked at there overall had a beneficial effect on glycemic index. The comparators were various. Glucose, which is really what the comparator should be, but there was also comparisons with rice meal and wheat meal. So that's relevant in terms of this story. Fasting blood glucose is a pretty good indicator of the ability of the body to maintain glycemic control. A high or elevated fasting blood glucose is indicative of impairment in control. And this study looked at pre-diabetics, type 2 diabetics, and healthy. And again, overall, you can see that the picture was beneficial by having millets in the diet. There were different types of millets in that study. So that's, quite a good outcome. This is a very recent paper which has looked at other bioactive compounds in millets and anti-diabetic properties that they may have, involving the gut microbiota, which connects to the issue of dietary fiber that we talked about a minute ago. Finally, despite the benefits that millets have, or seem to have, they definitely will need help. They will need help because there are nutrients that plants cannot supply. Millets under the plants cannot supply, but are important for the utilization of the nutrients that plants do supply. The two nutrients, there's others, but the two nutrients I think are the most important are vitamin D and vitamin B12. Vitamin D, this is a vitamin D deficiency in the world. It's not very new, but I think it's still relevant. And you can see here that India is regarded as the most vitamin D deficient country in the world. 70 to 90% of Indians being suboptimal vitamin D status. And that's very counterintuitive to many people because of the fact that India gets a lot of sunshine. And in theory, people can synthesize vitamin D in the skin with the use of sunshine. There's more to it than that, though, which will, if anybody has questions. And of course, historically, vitamin D has been known to be involved in skeletal development, calcium absorption, and calcium and bone mineralization. And one of the things that people sometimes used to see, certainly in Western Europe, was this issue of rickets in children, where basically the mineralization of the long leg bones isn't adequate. The bones remain soft. The weight of the body then makes the leg bend, and that's a classic sign of rickets. It's not very common now in Western societies, although it still does occur sometimes. There are now many more functions of vitamin D, which we don't have time to go into, but nevertheless, they're very important. And as I said, I think I said a minute ago, we now know that vitamin D needs iron, actually, and magnesium for activation. This was a study done actually in Hyderabad, in the Mallah Medical College in Hyderabad. Basically, they were looking at children that were coming into the hospital and just basically scoring them in terms of whether or not they had rickets or to what degree they had rickets. And overall, you can see that 70% of male children had rickets, 30% of female children had rickets. And the overall conclusion or the overall recommendation was that vitamin D should be supplemented, and indeed it should. India is also pretty deficient in vitamin B12, which you might expect from a largely vegetarian diet. Vitamin B12 really only in animal foods, animal-derived foods. And we now, well, I say we now know, we've known for a long time that vitamin B12 is involved in blood cell formation. If you don't get that right, it can lead to a particular type of anemia, pernicious anemia, but that also is reflected in reduced hemoglobin. And I do wonder to what degree vitamin B12 is involved in the anemia story that we looked at earlier. I think it's something that needs to be looked at. Vitamin B12 also involved in neurological function, and particularly in the fetus and in the fetal development in the uterus. And of course, if you don't get an adequate amount of folic acid into the system, ideally before conception and for roughly the first 3 months of pregnancy, you run the risk of the development of neural tube defects. Spina bifida, which this is a picture of, is the most common of the neural tube defects. Now, it happens that that folic acid metabolism is dependent on a supply of vitamin B12. And other studies have now shown that in suboptimal vitamin B12 situations, that does also increase the risk of neural tube defects. And I was just looking at the prevalence in the UK. It's about 13 cases of neural tube defects per 10,000 live births. I guess there's more in terms of total births, but not many probably. Whereas in India, the same figure is 70. So again, I do wonder to what degree vitamin B12 is involved in the higher prevalence. Okay, I think my time is just about up. I'll just leave you with a few conclusions which you can perhaps read, I think my overall conclusion is that it's all very well to create diets, food products that are sustainably produced, and perhaps have a low environmental impact. But if they do not provide the nutrients that are needed to deal with some of these big issues, particularly in India, then they're not really sustainable. Thank you very much.